Thank you, Joel. That's such a great introduction. I feel so flattered because I really love working with Joel as well. And I love having conversations with him because he just has so many insights and such interesting experience. So it's fun to trade those. So we talked a little on the Slack channel. I just love having these Slack channels to talk with participants. And I know example mapping is not familiar to a lot of people. And I'm going to try to explain things as I go, but if I do fail to explain something you don't understand, be sure to ask a question. I can't see the Slack channel right now. I can see the Q&A in the Zoom. Oops.
Forget about the questions, and if I promise, if I see anything that it's worth stopping you for, I will jump right in and I will stop you. Okay?
Sounds good. Thanks.
Okay.
So as Joel said, I am an animal lover. I have 3 donkeys and 3 cats and 2 dogs at home, and I really enjoy spending time with them all. And I a testing advocate at Mabel, as Joel said, and together with Janet Gregory over the last couple of decades, we've written a couple of books, which Joel mentioned. We also have a 5-hour video course, and we also have a 3-day live training course that we developed and we offer through the Agile Testing Fellowship. But I've been a hands-on tester on Agile teams for the last close to 20 years. And before that, I was a tester on waterfall teams. And before that, I was a programmer. I've done a lot of different things. So today, I'd like to share example mapping with you. And I'm distracted because I can't get the Q&A thing out of my way. Jerry gave a lot of techniques yesterday in her talk about getting a deep understanding for what's valuable to customers and creating personas for them and creating user value stories. And I really like that focus on user value. And example mapping is a way to help make sure that the whole team understands and delivers that value to the customers. So you really stay focused on what they want. And I'm going to do that by teaching you how to facilitate your own example mapping discovery workshop. I usually do this session as a hands-on workshop, but I couldn't figure out how to do that online. So this is what I'm going to try. It's an experiment. So Matt Wynn originated example mapping, and somebody already posted this link in the Slack channel for my speaker Slack channel. And you can see his introduction here, and he's written and talked a lot about this, and we're grateful to him for coming up with this. I learned about it from Matt at the big Agile conference a few years ago. He had a session or a workshop on it, and I couldn't go to. So I just sat down with him in the hallway at the conference, and he just very quickly drew things for me on a piece of paper and explained it to me. And I think that's really, really simple. And at the time, my own team was experiencing a lot of frustration because we would get stories from our product owner. We thought we understood them. We would code and test them and deliver them to the product owner, and the product owner would say, well, that's not what I wanted, and reject them. And that, some of that rejection is normal. Thomas pointed out in the Slack channel that in Agile, it is normal for stories to get rejected sometimes to help clarify requirements. But when it gets a really high, a third of your stories are starting to be rejected. And of course, because the product owner didn't test them right away, there's a delay of a few days because he's a bottleneck. Then it's really frustrating. The developers and the whole team have moved on to new stories, and now you have to go back and redo this other one. It's just awful. And it really slows down the cycle time. So the cycle time is from when you start working on the story to when you actually release it in production. So given that problem, I thought maybe example mapping would be a good way to make sure we understand these stories better up front. So as testers, we ask a lot of questions early, especially in Agile teams, or even if you're not in an Agile team. It's something if you can get involved in planning meetings and requirements meetings and things like that. And Jerry talked a lot about these kind of things yesterday. Testing is thinking. We need a lot of thinking. And example mapping is a way to help us think of these questions. So as I said, it's, you know, it's about if your stories are getting rejected a lot. So stop and think for a minute. Does this happen to you? Do you get a lot of pushback from your business stakeholders or even from your customers when you deliver a feature and they say, well, that isn't really what I want at all. I'm not going to use that feature. It's not working the way I like it. It's not behaving correctly. So think about any kind of pain that you and your team have had a lot about this. And then also the time it takes you to get these stories or get these features out to customers. So that's what we're looking at, and that's the problem we're trying to solve. You know, and also, do you have a lot of disagreements over how something should work? Do you as a tester say, hey, I just found a bug, and have a developer say, well, that's not a bug, that's what the story, that's how that feature is supposed to behave. And then you have to go and get the product owner or designer or somebody else to tell you who's right. And maybe you're both wrong. So it's all this confusion, and that leads to a lot of extra time. You may have seen the little cartoon that shows the story of the swing. So the customer wants a swing in a tree, and the designer designs it really fancy, and then the product owner has some other idea of how it should look, and the developer implements it so that it has one rope on each side of the tree trunk and doesn't swing at all. And it turns out what the customer just wanted was a tire swing, just one rope hanging with a tire hanging from it. And, you know, this is small differences in perceptions, but that causes big problems. And rework slows us down and frustrates us. We don't like it. So using discovery workshops, we can build shared understanding. So some of you may be familiar with the idea of Three Amigos from George Dinwiddie. Janet and I called this Power of Three in our books, but Three Amigos is way better. And the idea is you get a tester, a developer, a product owner, maybe a designer or a database expert or somebody else that you need together, and talk about each story or each piece of a feature. And this is a way to build shared understanding before you start actually testing and coding that story. So we all see the tire swing. We don't all see 6 different versions of how you could put a swing in a tree. And I find that example mapping it's easy to learn it just by doing it. So I'm going to spend 45 minutes telling you about it. You could just sit down and do it pretty quickly. And so get your team together and try this. It's really fun. Doesn't take long. Get some 4 colors of index cards or sticky notes and some markers that are easy to read. And then you need, depending on how many people you have, a large room or at least 2 separate rooms or spaces, because you're going to need to separate people out to where they can't hear each other. That's part of the game. And then start your workshop. Get everybody in one room to start with, and then have them break into an even number of teams of 2 to 4 people. So 2, 3, or 4 people on each team. And then we're going to form pairs of teams. So we're going to have 2 teams pair up. And each pair of teams, one is the team that's going to make the rules about a story, and the other team is going to guess the rules about a story. And again, I'm using the agile term of story or user story. If you don't use that terminology, just, you know, a feature or a small piece of a feature. So we've got these different teams, these different pairs of teams. And this is the story we're going to talk about. And so have everybody write this down on a card, a white or yellow card. We use these color-coded cards. So as a user, I want help to create a strong password so that I have limited risk for identity theft. So that's our story. Now we're going to separate the teams. So they don't have to be in different rooms as long as they can get far enough apart that they can't hear each other. But whatever works best in your facility. So you got your make rules teams in one spot and your guest rules teams in another. So the guest rules teams, they don't have anything to do for the first few minutes. So just tell them to maybe talk about the frustration they've experienced when they didn't understand the requirements for a story. Excuse me. Now we're going to explain the exercise to the Make Rules teams. And Matt Wynn, when he does this game, he calls it the password game, he time boxes it really tightly. I have not been able to do it in the tight time boxes he has, but it is important to keep people moving along. You don't want this to take a long time. So now we're going to explain things to the teams that are going to make the rules. So they have this story about creating a strong password. They should invent 3 rules for what makes a valid password of acceptable security. And I know there are a lot of different opinions on this. I'm just using this as an example. Some people say, well, it doesn't matter about the password. We should have passphrases, whatever. We're not going to get into that. But this is just for the process of the game. So the rules should be secret. So only the Make Rules team knows them. But you can be imaginative, have some fun with it. So, you know, you could say, oh, it shouldn't be the name of an animal, or it should be something about donkeys, whatever you want to have. And hang on, I'll give you the rest of the instructions. So we're going to ask the Make Rules teams to create 3 examples that illustrate their 3 rules. So they're going to write 1 rule per sticky note or card, and they're going to note on there if it's valid or invalid. So they should use you know, pick a color of card to use. So you're going to use a different color for rules and examples. So blue for rules and green for examples, maybe. I know I have yellow here, but so we're gonna give the Make Rules teams 4 minutes. Is about what I find works well. It takes them a while to settle down and get started. So you start off your timer, have them start making their rules and examples. And as a facilitator, you walk around and just try to get them from being too carried away. Don't make it too hard. They need to have rules that can be specified with a single example. So they have to be a little bit simple. But be firm on the time box. Keep this workshop moving along. Okay, so the 4 minutes are over. They've got secret rules that they've written down, 1 per sticky note, and then they've got the 3 examples they've written down on a card or a sticky note. Now the guest rules teams can come in and get with their partner team, but they can't talk to each other. So they just get the cards or the sticky notes with the examples on them, and they have to try to figure out what the rules are. So they should write the rules down, and again, 1 rule per sticky note or card. And then they get 3 minutes to write the rules down and then give them back to their partner team. And again, make sure they don't talk. So while they guess the rules, again, you're just gonna walk around and make sure they don't talk and be firm about your time box. Okay, so we've gone through the Make the Rules team has made the rules. They've made the 3 examples. They've given those examples to the guest rules team. The guest rules team has tried to write down the 3 rules if they could guess them and give them back to the Make Rules team. So probably my experience is they don't usually get all the rules the first try. So we have to do another round. So if they didn't guess all the rules, the Make Rules team should write some new examples for any rules that were not guessed. So 1 to 3 examples. If they didn't get any rules guessed, they'll have to have 3 new examples. And then give them 2 minutes to do that. And then they should pass those examples back to their partner team, the one that's going to guess the rules. But they still can't talk to each other. So we're going to give them 2 minutes for that. And we're going to ask the guest rules teams to get the new examples, write down their new guesses for the rules, and still no talking.
Lisa, 1 second. There's a question here, and actually I was thinking this to myself.
Okay.
Can the guest rules team talk to one another as long as the Make Rules team doesn't hear, or they cannot talk to themselves?
Yeah, it's just each team can talk within themselves, but the guest rules team can't go ask the make rules team, for example, questions about their.
Okay. Well, I had the same question. Someone asked us, hey, no, I'm going to ask you now. Okay, go
Thank
ahead.
you. I should have made that more clear.
No worries.
So yeah, they can talk amongst themselves. I should have made that more clear. Sorry about that. But there is a tendency for them to want to go and ask for clarification, and they're not allowed to do that. Okay, so the guest rules teams took another shot at guessing the rules, and they gave those rules, those guesses back to the make rules team. So now let them talk to each other. Now everybody can talk. And then the guest rules team is going to learn what the rules really are. And the make rules team is going to learn how good they were at creating examples. And so now ask them to share their results. Did the guest rules teams guess all the rules correctly? And if they didn't, ask the guest rules team if they didn't get all the rules, how many more examples do they think they'd need to get them correct? So let them think about how effective were these examples and how many examples do they need to be able to understand a business rule when they can't see the rule. Now this is pretty enlightening. And then ask everybody, you know, what are you taking away from this exercise? What are you learning? And then ask them, what's better, examples or rules? And why do you say that, which one's better? Why do you say that? Or maybe it's best to have both, like peanut butter and chocolate. They're better together. So to give you some more context on my approach to example mapping, before I learned about this, back in 2003, Brian Merritt came up with something he called example-driven development. And his idea was that for each feature that we're going to develop, we need concrete examples of how that feature should behave, and also examples of misbehaviors to avoid. So just concrete examples, and really write down these scenarios. So this is before we had things like behavior-driven development. It was just taking the examples of, well, you know, when the user creates a password, when the user has a password that doesn't meet this rule about needing a special character, give them this error message. And Janet and I worked perfectly well, we thought, from having just the examples. Our teams basically did example-driven development. We turned those examples into executable tests that guided development, and we were happy. But once I learned about the rules, it added another dimension. The rules are very specific, the business rules, and it helps the developers be very specific about the code that they write. The examples help illustrate the rules, but the rules are really what they're working off of. And that was a real aha moment for me. And it was a real aha moment for my team, because indeed, when we started experimenting with example mapping, we did have our rejection rate and our cycle time go down dramatically. So it really worked for us. I'll talk more about that in a minute. So you've had this workshop with your team. It didn't take very long because we have those short time boxes, and everybody got to experience what it was like to work just from examples. And so now I would wrap up the workshop that you give with some more explanations about example mapping. When do you do example mapping? So I'll tell you so you can tell your team when you do your workshop. The best time to do it is before you have a planning meeting. So if you're doing Scrum, you have a sprint planning meeting, or other kinds of agile developments, you may do an iteration planning meeting with the whole delivery team there. Some of you may be doing Kanban, and so you just plan kind of as needed. You might plan a few stories to be ready to be in your ready to go column. Or maybe you plan less often if you're in a more waterfall type environment. But before you're going to get together and plan features and slice those features up into stories or small features, that's when we want to have the three amigos meetings. And I often call them, or my teams often call them, pre-planning meetings. And the idea is you have a lot fewer people than you probably have in your regular planning meetings. So I would have no more than 5 people. And again, mainly to have somebody representing testing, development, and the product people. But you may also need to bring in, depending on the feature set that you're working on, maybe you need to have the designer there to ask questions, or an operations expert or a database expert, whoever. You need who you need. We use these color-coded cards. So yellow for story, blue for rule, green for example, pink or red for question. And you don't have to use these exact colors. I sometimes forget which is which and have to look at this picture. But it's just to separate them out. And for each rule, you're going to create at least one example. So the process is, we're going to talk about a story. We'll write down the story on the story card. And then we start asking the product owner or the designer, whoever is appropriate, for the business rules. And so for the password, we might have rules like this: minimum 8, max 32, whatever. And then for each rule, ask for examples of valid and invalid passwords, for example, or valid or expected behavior and misbehavior. How should it work? What should we make sure it doesn't do? And this is going to start eliciting a lot more questions as you start to go through the examples. And you'll realize there are more rules perhaps than you thought. And if you end up with lots of rules, lots of cards with rules on them in a short time, or you start finding yourself talking about the story for more than 10 or 15 minutes, that's a sign that that story is too big. And so you may need to go back and, not plan that one yet, split it up into smaller stories first. So that's the other great thing about example mapping, is it identifies when a piece of work is just too big. So we want to do small granular stories or small pieces of features so that we can get them finished in a couple of days and get feedback on them. So we don't want to have to spend, a week or more working on one thing. So this is another advantage of example mapping. And the other thing is to capture the questions that nobody can answer. So even though you have these different roles in the room, which is really great because you're getting the different perspectives, you're going to get the different views of what a tire swing might look like, for example. You may have questions people can't answer. So maybe somebody asks, well, what does the data for this look like? And do we have test data? Maybe we're going to be working with a third party, and we need to know what the data is going to look like coming from them, API endpoint or something like that. So if we don't know the answer to that question, write them down. And hopefully you can get that question answered before your planning meeting, or for sure get it answered before we actually start working on that story. So maybe the question is even, is this really the right feature? And maybe, as Jerry was talking about value to the customer, is this really something of value to the customer, or do they really want something else? Maybe we need to go back and do more research with the users. Look at our personas and make sure we got the right personas, for example. So here's an example map. And my friend Joellen Carter and I have done this workshop before. And she works for a company called Olo, and they're based in New York City, but most of their employees are remote. And so they have an application they designed to schedule their team meetings with these people who are in the main office and people who are remote. So here's a sample example map, an example map for this app. So some of the business rules are, if you have more than 2 people in the New York office in a meeting, then the scheduled event should include a meeting room. We should have a meeting room for that calendar event. And what does that mean? Well, here's an example. If there's a meeting with more than 2 but less than 3 people, it can be in the green sauce meeting room. Olo does software for restaurants, so all their conference rooms are named after food, which I find hilarious. If they have more than 4 people, that's not going to fit in the green sauce room. So that's got to be in the bacon cheeseburger room. So this is all to help the application automatically select the correct room. And then if there are remote attendees, they need to have a video link. So they've got a meeting with somebody from the Ukraine in it, it needs to have a Zoom meeting number. And an additional rule is about the time of the meeting. So they've got people in all these time zones. They need to fall within normal work hours for all attendees. So we can have examples of what are valid times to have it, depending on who's in the meeting. And we could also have examples of what are invalid times. You can't have that time because that's not when those people are at work. But now we've got questions like, well, we don't have a conference room for more than 12 people. What if we have more than 12 people? Or what if we have so many distributed meetings? Is that going to start to cause conflicts? So this illustrates how having both examples and the rules adds value, and then important questions that we really need to know before we can finish working on the story. Now, my team, where I started doing example mapping, we had a lot of remote team members. And we actually tried using, there are a lot of online tools that simulate using cards or sticky notes. We tried Cardboard It, which I really like as an application, but we found for example mapping, it just was a little bit too slow. There was too much lag time for the remote people. If I were doing this again with a remote team, I might try real-time board because I find the performance of that is really good. And so what we did was we used our online story tracking, project tracking tool, and we simply created a template to include the story name, or the description of the story, or the name of the story, the goal, the purpose, the user value. So we always really wanted to stay focused on the user value, so we always put a goal. That's not part of example mapping, that's just something we did. But I recommend it. And then we put the rules, we put the examples, and notice we were using personas here. And then we also put the questions. I just couldn't fit that into my screenshot and still make it readable. So this is a good alternative. We found this worked just fine. So it's whatever you're used to. And what we found was, because it was available, and then everyone on the team could go read these before the iteration planning meeting, where everybody on the team talked about the stories and estimated them. We did no estimates. Well, I don't want to get off too sidetracked on that, but we would decide if a story was doable in a day or not, because we didn't want our stories to be longer than that. But anyway, we could read these in advance, and it gave us a chance to ask questions. And so what we found was that everybody, when we started the iteration planning meeting, everybody was on the same page. Everybody had already a good understanding of the story. And of course, during that meeting, more questions came up, more things were discussed. But even though we added a whole meeting, it's cut down the time of the iteration planning meeting. So and it also cut down on rejected stories and cycle time. So in the long run, it saved us a lot of time. So it was worth having this extra meeting with just a few people. So the benefits: everybody understands the story. Everybody sees the same thing when they think about the story. We get the questions answered. It's really good for noticing missing parts of a feature, or stories that are too big and need splitting up, or even features that are kind of overblown and we just need to pare them back. They've just got too many bells and whistles, and we just want to stick to the basics. And again, less rework, shorter cycle time, less frustration. And I don't remember the exact numbers anymore. It might be in my blog post for how much our cycle time went down, but it was pretty dramatic. I mean, our story rejection rate went down by like 50% within a month, and our cycle time probably went down that much as well. So it was pretty dramatic for us. And you know, it's such a simple technique. So the other nice thing is that these can become executable tests. Now, I will caution you, those of you who are doing behavior-driven development or acceptance test-driven development or specification by example, don't try to write the tests in these pre-planning Amigos meetings. These, just do the example mapping, do the examples, but don't try to write BDD type scenarios, the given when then sort of thing. Do that later. So the three Amigos can write those scenarios later based on these examples. The examples and the goal of the story make a great place to start. And then these business facing tests can be executable, they can be automated, and they can guide development and help us know what code to write. And they could be very specific. So I've got an example here that's a more of a tabular test. All right, so you've done your workshop and you're there with your team and you've explained example mapping to them. They've gotten a chance to try it. What do you do next? Well, as part of the workshop, sometimes I try it with a real story. Or just ask the team, can we experiment with this? Can we try this before the next planning meeting? Before we get the whole team together to talk about stories, can we have a small meeting with just the Amigos and do example mapping? And be sure that you set a goal. Now for us, we were looking at our cycle time. If you've got maybe a different problem that it can help with, then you can set some goal so that you know whether it's working for you or not. I'm really a big believer in experiments with a measurable hypothesis and a small experiment, like just try it for a couple weeks, try it for a month. Don't commit to doing it forever. It might scare people, so don't do that. And again, as you go, then evaluate your progress. And ask the team, do they find it helpful? The developers on my team were they were so relieved because there was all this extra information about the story before they were asked to estimate it. And as they started working on the story, there's just so much great information. They could use the information to help, we could use the information to help do our behavior-driven development tests. And if it didn't work for you, there are lots of other techniques for having structured conversations. For example, Ellen Gottesdiener and Mary Gorman have a great book called Discover to Deliver, and it has a lot of techniques for structuring these types of conversations. So lots of ways to do it, and just see what works for your team. And again, testing is thinking, and testers have a unique mindset. Example mapping is one way to really get involved and use your mindset and ask good questions. So remember to collaborate with the rest of your team, but bring the special skills and special perspective that you have as a tester, and you can really add value to this process. I find it really helpful for getting everybody talking and listening to each other and really understanding what our customers want, going back to Jerry's session yesterday. So I have some more resources here for you to learn more about it. I highly recommend this book that Gus Barnaghi and Seb Rose have written called Discovery. They have a website, bddbooks.com, or you can find it on Leanpub or Amazon as well. But they're working on a second book. So they talk a lot about example mapping in their book and how to use it. And there's some other good blog posts here. And I assume the slides are going to be available to you as well as the video, but if not, I'd be happy to send you a copy of the slides. So I think I finished a little early, but that gives us time for questions.
Oh,
now,
don't
I
worry.
know
We're okay with that.
some of you are probably tired if you spent all day yesterday learning from this conference, and now we're starting a whole nother day. So I understand if you're tired, but and I want to assure you that Chester was not harmed in the making of this picture.
He looks to be having too much fun in order to be harmed or anything. Lisa, first of all, thanks a lot. I love it when you actually are able to bring something very, very, very concrete even if it looks small, actually it adds value, and that's great, because I guess that everyone can just go ahead and start adding more and more examples and playing with that and showing the value. So that's cool in itself. There are a couple of questions here, and so you answered some of them, but maybe it might be a good idea to just go over that a little bit more.
Sure, that's great.
Okay, so first question is very simple, and again, it's whether you like it or not. Can Trello be used on that? I'm not sure if I would.
I think so. I think any online tracking tool could be used, and I would just recommend, I don't know if Trello allows it, but have some kind of template that you can use. If Trello doesn't have a template feature, you could just paste in a template.
I was actually thinking about it. Why not use Google Docs with a template? But again, that's just me. We love Google Docs.
Exactly.
Cool. You mentioned that a couple of times, but let's say that we're working more Scrum, okay? And let's say that we're doing formal Scrum. When would be the right time to do this?
And on my Scrum team, we did this a day or two before our sprint planning. So we had 2-week cycles. So our sprint planning was on a Friday. We would do this on the Wednesday or Thursday, and then that gave that gave us time to answer any questions that needed to be answered.
Follow-up question from me. I'm looking at my Scrum part. So what we try to do is that before the planning meeting, we do make the stories available to everyone, and not everyone's going to be looking at them. But you have those people who always look at them and come with feedback and more questions and stuff. What happens, let's say that you did, and you have a user story with 2 examples, 3 examples, 4 examples, doesn't matter. But then between the moment that you did this exercise and the planning meeting, someone comes and says, hey, you know what? It's still not clear to me because maybe this example contradicts this other example. What do you do? Do you actually get the 3 amigos again involved? What do you do in those cases?
I would just talk about it at the planning meeting itself. That's going to happen. You're still going to have questions. You're still going to have people think of something, people who weren't in the example mapping session or maybe who were and just didn't think of it at the time, realize that, oh, there's a gap here, there's something missing, or this rule isn't really correct, or this example isn't really correct. So that's okay. You're going to talk about it in the planning meeting.
Okay. Interesting question. Have you seen that the example mapping will focus mostly on test cases, on data, on testing scenarios? Where does it go usually?
It's really important to keep the focus on that value to customer. So as you're thinking of the business roles, there might be a lot of small things about it that are kind of minor, and that's not what we want to focus on. We want to really think about the goal of that story. What's the purpose? How's it going to help the business? How's that going to help the customer? And make sure that most of our rules and examples are about that central value. And again, there might be some little, there might be design considerations if it's a UI, or certainly we'd have security considerations, but maybe those are pretty standard. So, things that aren't quite as important, that aren't perfect, that's okay.
Would you focus more on, I guess that it's important not to leave outside the process, and again, not to focus only on the data, but do to try to cover in the scenario data and a little bit of the flow maybe?
Yeah, definitely the functionality, how should it, system behavior, basically, and customers, think about the customer scenarios, how are they going to use it, and how should it accommodate those scenarios.
Okay, is this, again, going to another question, so I didn't send them like this. Should this be used in addition or instead of the acceptance criteria of the user story?
This is the acceptance criteria, I think, are very similar, but I would do both really. And I think I might do the example mapping first, so that there's a better understanding of the story, and then write the acceptance criteria, and then start writing things like the high-level acceptance test cases. And again, the examples can really help you with that, but I don't think it takes the place of that.
Okay, now we have a couple of questions that are not necessarily related to example mapping, but I think that you have enough experience just to answer them. And okay. I'd love to, yeah, sorry, I'm gonna shoot at you, don't worry. You're a big girl, you know how to handle them. Okay, let's talk a little bit about complexity. And it's interesting because I've seen this. So I'm just gonna read the question from Thomas.
Okay.
What if a story is already in planning or development and it is discovered that this story has too much complexity and too many questions, etc. Should it be moved back to pre-planning until it's being afforded further to discussion? Should we handle that where we are? What do you think should be done? What's in your experience?
In my experience, if we're in an example mapping session or an iteration planning session, and it becomes clear that maybe the story's too big or it's really not the answer to the customer problem that we wanted, I would just give those back in the Scrum. I would just give those back to the product owner and say, now you need to go back to the business stakeholders and rethink this, or maybe the designer needs to do more user research. I would just send it back, because at that point you're gonna end up spending so much time talking about it in the planning session. That becomes a waste of time. So,
what if it's further down the line?
Pardon? Oh, further down the line. Yeah, I might stop working on it and say, okay, we need more clarity on this. Let's put it back in the backlog for now. Let's pause the story till we get these answers. And maybe we're not going to do it. So we don't want to finish a feature or piece of a feature that isn't what the customer wants.
Okay, nice answer. Question in general, given the fact that you facilitate a lot of workshops, are there any resources that you would recommend to people who want to learn more about workshop facilitations?
Oh my. I do have some, but I'm trying to think off the top of my head.
Well, you can actually, it's okay to say, hey, you know what, I'm going to post that on the Slack channel.
Yeah, I could definitely put that on the Slack channel. I mean, some of it is just practicing, but there are really, really good techniques. I'd give you one resource place to start. I think it's really, really important. It really changed my ability to facilitate workshops. And that's a book by Sharon Bowman called Training from the Back of the Room. And she's based it on science of how we learn and how our brains work and how you can create a learning experience. For example, this isn't an ideal learning experience because part of learning is actually moving and like using your hands and walking around. That's part of what helps you learn. Another part of help you learn is talking to each other. We can't actively talk to each other in this conference, but we can talk to each other on Slack. So that is really enhancing people's learning opportunity. So I would read that book, and also you can take classes to teach you that, training from the back of the room. There are official classes you can take, but that would be my number one go-to.
By the way, someone just posted the link to that book on the channel.
Oh, wonderful.
Yeah, we have people who are actually very active on the channel, so that's cool.
Yeah.
Last but not least, because we need to start cutting short, any specific tips if you're going to be doing this on international teams, if you're going to be doing it on this, you know what, I'm going to leave it like that, international, not only distributed, because I find that, for example, we get to work with a lot of foreign people, and working with Japanese people is going to be different from working with German people, definitely different from working with Israeli people, even when you're doing these type of workshops. So any tips, tricks from your experience on that?
I haven't personally done example mapping with international teams, but I guess that would be, I would say, experiment with those online tools and see what really works best for the team. So for my team, it worked really well to just put it in text in a story. Maybe that's not the best thing if people's have different languages and things like that. So maybe it would be better to use something online like real-time board that's visual. I could see that might work better to kind of get past the language problems and make things really visible. But if anybody has done this in international teams, that was a great question. I'd love to know what you've done.
I'm actually thinking about, again, some of the stuff that we do with our customers. By the way, because many times one of the things that we like doing in practice specifically is not only having product involved, maybe because I'm product, but sometimes even getting some of the customers who suggested the features involved. So I think like these kind of ways where you can actually go and say, hey, help us in this example mapping, maybe not live, but yes, on a sense of, what do you think about that? What do you think about that? That might be a good way. But then again, we do work with people from everywhere. So it might be a little bit challenging.
Cool.
I'll tell you once we do it, don't worry. Okay, guys, first of all, Jerry, sorry. Lisa, thank you very much. I went to Jerry because I was amazed of how you actually we're able to link it to Jerry's presentation yesterday, and yes, they're related, but it's nice to see the flow. And I guess we'll continue seeing this today because there are quite a lot of additional sessions that talk to one another. But again, thanks for sharing it, and thanks for bringing us this additional tool. It's great.
Oh, it's my pleasure. I was really excited to see Jerry's session because it's like, oh, this really feeds into exactly what I'm talking, the kind of thing I'm talking about. So it's really nice.